Okay, so um I wanted to thank my new subscribers. What did I get last night? Like 15. Thank you. Um on my way. So and I gave the update to everything of dog and stuff like on OF. So I can get right into the reading. Let's go. Got my coffee there. It's so nice to see you, Rob. After you went through today. Eric, Darth. All right, everyone pop it in. All right. So I think that yesterday we had like just started on a new chapter. Yeah, we're a brigade no more. Yeah. So remember he had gotten um injured and um in his knee, I believe, like it was infected or like he needed time uh off so he wouldn't have permanent injury and he wasn't in fighting shape. So that's exactly where we left off, that he has 20 days of leave. So granted a medical leave, Marr set off for New York, traveling with the embalmed body of Major Horgan. And remember, Major Horgan was someone who um, was, I believe, only like 30 years old and had been fighting since the beginning with this guy. And so it really, I mean, they all mean something to him, but maybe this was like symbolic of something. We'll see. So he has the body and he's going to New York. On Christmas Eve, 1862, at the Broadway headquarters of the Irish Brigade, Marr stayed up late writing letters to families of the deceased. Libby urged him to come home to be festive for a few hours. For too long, sorrow had shadowed their marriage. Horgan lay in a casket next to Marr's desk, his body full of lead balls, his facial features improved by a mortician's magic. Speaking of morticians, Rob told me there's like a new, is it a docu-series on HBO that's, um, is it a mortuary? I forget, but it's like something creepy. And he kind of urged me not to watch it at night before bed, but I'm sort of curious. I mean, I should just be clean before bed, but if I do, one of you guys better recruit to watch it with me, at least part of it. Because HBO has good production, but anyway, it just reminded me of that. Oh, nice to see you, John, Daryl, Dan. Rob says yes. Okay. Looking heavenly in those pantyhose. You notice I've been wearing the same pair for like days. I should do a giveaway for one of you, right? Yes. And wash them first. Wink, wink. I'm sure they are fine. I don't even think they're a special brand or anything. Well, to be honest with you, like I hang like a lot of my pantyhose as they take up more space with all the packaging. So I hang them. I should do another tour like in my house so you can see all the pantyhose hanging on the wall. So I don't just know by just like the package. Anyway. My house is a monument to pantyhose. For 3 nights and 2 days, the officer's corpse was on display. It was, to say the least, not an inducement to further recruitment, but Marr didn't need the shaking heads, the hushed signs of the cross, the mutterings of shame, shame, to understand how things had changed among his people. The Irish had turned against the Union cause. From the press and the pulpits, From the laborer in the Tammany hiring hall to the widow in church, he heard a dirge. The Irish spirit for the war is dead, cried the Boston pilot. Voice of the Bay States Celts, absolutely dead. New Year's Eve arrived with some suspense regarding Lincoln's intentions. Awaiting word, blacks in New York City staged a jubilee to count down the final hours of Confederate slavery. A crowd that was one-third white filled Shiloh Presbyterian Church at the corner of Prince and Marion to capacity at 10 p.m. A preacher asked the congregants to imagine what would have happened if slaves had been freed immediately after Fort Sumter was fired on. The war would now be over, he said, to a clap of amens. No one was more loyal to the United States, he said, than the descendants of those brought to these shores in chains. Another speaker attacked clerics who had used their religion to defend slavery. An ex slave spoke of growing up in North Carolina, a most excellent place to get out of, he said to laughter. A few minutes after midnight, a dispatch was read from Washington. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued. It was the greatest event in our nation's history, said Frederick Douglass. Thunderous cheers for Abraham Lincoln erupted in the Shiloh pews. Tears and some fainting and breathless asides. Then more huzzas for the Union Army, in which blacks would now be able to serve. And then a hymn from the choir beginning, Blow ye trumpets, blow the year of Jubilee has come. In another church 2 weeks later, the Irish held a grand requiem mass for the fallen of Fredericksburg. St. Patrick's Cathedral on Mulberry Street was draped in black and packed with widows, many refusing to meet the gaze of Thomas Marr, who sat in the front row with Libby. In the center aisle was a single coffin representing those buried in hastily dug graves along the Rappahannock. Yeah, I figured it was a symbol of something. Not that he didn't care about all of them. The choir sang Mozart's Requiem, the music rising to the top of the 85-foot high vault, morning light streaming through stained glass that the know nothings had once tried to smash. Baskets were passed for families without fathers, and dagger John Hughes sent the souls off to an eternal Irish repose. Afterward, officers of the Irish Brigade retired to Delmonico's for lunch. Marr gave a few short remarks, but there was no spark in him. He was visibly aged and made sluggish by war's physical toll. We have but two wants today, one for the dead, the other for the living, he said. He was supposed to be recruiting, but on this day could not bring himself to corral another man with his words. Only a cryptic thought. War for me has no attraction beyond those developments it gives for hearts and minds. After weeks of rest, he returned to the front, but first a detour to Washington for a meeting with the president on Lincoln's 54th birthday, February 12th, 1863. Lincoln looked gaunt, sunken cheeked, his clothes loose and oversized. He moved about in a strangely soundless manner, as if he were there in spirit and not in corporal form. Marr had gone to Washington to beg for the Irish Brigade's life. The unit needed time to recover and rebound, and only then could he hope to fill its ranks with new soldiers. The general's reputation had preceded him. His bravery in battle, first to the front, last to retreat, certainly, but also the drinking, as well the odd tale of the death beast with the cannon ball at dessert had circulated among the high command. Marr did not try to explain the inexplicable life of an Irishman at war. He spoke only of trying to save his creation. Lincoln listened without word. Marr made a pitch for promotions of his officers, good men, Colonels Robert Nugent and Patrick Kelly, had been passed over despite stellar performances in combat, while men who'd done less fighting in other brigades had been elevated. Yep, not fair. Lincoln unfolded the large sticks in winter fingers of his, walked across the room, and shook Marr's hand. No sooner had the general left than the president wrote a letter to the War Department. General Marr, now with me, says the Irish Brigade has had no promotions and that they had fairly earned them. Not far from the White House, Private McCarter had taken a turn for the worse in a crowded ward for the wounded at Eckington Hospital after he had committed his soul to the afterlife at Mary's Heights. The boy remained conscious. Oh, there, he's there, bleeding on the ground, consumed by thirst. I would have given $1,000 for a cup of cold water, he wrote. In the evening, under the cover of darkness, McCarter was dragged down the hill by his comrades and helped across the river. At Falmouth, the medical corps set up 40 tents to hack away at the wounded, a village of butcher shops, McCarter called it, with pyramids of severed limbs outside every tent. When McCarter was brought in for his turn at medical attention, a doctor told him, "You must have that arm taken off." "Nix," said McCarter, without a hint of his stammer. From Fredericksburg, the wounded were taken by rail to a river port, and then by steamer to Alexandria and off to the hospital outside Washington. Through January, McCarter's upper arm festered, turning the color of rotten fruits. By February, it did not even resemble a human appendage. The flesh and some muscle had fallen away, and what was left ballooned out of proportion, 2 times its natural size, assuming a most sickening and revolting appearance. Crammed into a large room with 50 other wounded men, McCarter was on track to an early grave. The ward surgeon, Dr. Edling, arrived with a sheaf of papers. He was unusually solicitous this morning, McCarter noticed, taking personal interest in his condition. After the doctor left, an extravagant meal arrived: roast beef, potatoes, bread, mince pie, and a glass of bitter ale. They were fattening him up for the kill, the private thought. The next day, a nurse brought him a fresh or a fresh gown and told him he was wanted in the office of the head surgeon. 3 doctors greeted McCarter warmly. The wound, a mush of broken bone fragments and a bullet, was unveiled and studied. McCarter asked if they were now going to saw his arm off. "Oh, no, I hope that won't be necessary," said Dr. Edling. "We have brought you up here to place you in more comfortable and quiet quarters. You shall receive our best attention." Taken aback, McCarter wondered what had happened to change his fortune. The doctor produced a lengthy handwritten note in a spiky penmanship that was vaguely familiar to the private. "A letter from a friend of yours who wants you to be well cared for. He is a friend of my own, too." The doctor showed McCarter the note, but covered the signature at the end. The wounded young man now recognized Thomas Marr's scrawl, the letters unable to keep up with the mind that committed them to paper. How did he know I was here? The doctor kept his secret, pressed his finger to his lips, smiled. Private McCarter never found out how General Marr got wind of his whereabouts, and he never heard from him again. In March, McCarter was released to a hospital in his home state of Pennsylvania, his right arm still attached at the shoulder, though largely useless except when he formed his fingers around a pen to cautiously craft the most exquisite calligraphy a certain lover of longhand had ever seen. Ambrose Burnside was out. Fighting Joe Hooker was in. The mood lifted considerably. "Oh, thank you, Jerry. Here we go. Congratulations, everybody. 5 more members. Okay. Mhm. Hooker outfitted his men in I feel like Hooker is such an unfortunate last name. Like, I'm sorry, but, like, I'm trying to think of, like, there's so many first names that can make it even worse. Like Harry Hooker or, descriptive names. Um, I see you, Jerry. And I'm sorry if any of you out there have the last name of Hooker. I don't mean to insult you. I'm sure you have a beautiful full name and it looks wonderful on a business card. Um, Hooker, Hooker, Hooker. Okay, back to the book. Um, Hooker outfitted his men in new uniforms and brought in wagon loads of fresh food from a supply line that seemed to stretch the length of the Rappahannock. Clean latrines were dug, cabins and tents sanitized, brick ovens produced hot bread every other day. Robert E. Lee was still across the river, about 3 miles downstream, camped beyond Mary's Heights. Hooker was eager to take a whack at the rebels, but he couldn't go anywhere until the ground firmed up in early spring. When Marr returned to camp after nearly a 2 month absence, his men were so happy to see him they serenaded him. He spent his first weeks writing copious correspondence to the War Department, occasionally dropping Abe Lincoln's name, trying to get a leave for the original 3 regiments he'd recruited from New York. The brigade has ceased to be a brigade, he wrote Edwin M. Stanton, the Secretary of War. Days went by without a reply, worse than a rejection. The high command ignored him, punishment perhaps for the death feast. Those close to him saw that Marr was at sea in his life. He had rallied his fellow exiles to this fight, and so carried the weight of his words. But he did not move men to die just because it was his great gift. He believed that hope for the Irish in America would never be realized if yeah, would he believed hope would never be realized if the nation remained torn in two. And he understood that his brigade in this new year was a force for ensuring that humans would never again be owned by other humans in the United States. Well, I mean, you can't account for everybody, but you try your best. As for freeing Ireland, well, someday, lads, someday. These convictions, hardened by the losses of Horgan and Haggerty, of Kavanagh and Clooney, and dozens of others whose young faces came to him at night when he tried to sleep with a gut full of whiskey, had caught him standing within the fractious diaspora of Irish America. No longer was the press friendly. We did not cause this war, wrote the Boston Pilot, but vast numbers of our people have perished in it. The commentary ranged from cynical to hostile, as if it were up to Marr to lead the Irish out of a war as he had led them into it. He never lost the talent or the nerve to take the ordinary and try to make it memorable. Stuck in winter mud, stuck without a way forward, stuck by the shunning silence from the War Department, Mark concocted a St. Patrick's Day festival that the Army of the Potomac would never forget. For the second time in this war, he put his men to work laying out a track for a steeplechase. He bargained for champagne and whiskey with the sutlers who trailed the Union supply line. A chapel of boughs and pine posts was assembled, and there on the morning of March 17th, Father Corby commenced the saint's holiday with mass, cannons firing in place of church bells ringing. For a day with Matt, for a day and night, the forlorn Falmouth camp was thick with brogue. I'm gonna get closer to my coffee. Daryl, what is a steeple? Daryl told me that when he was a kid, he got to ring the church bells on rare occasion, and he would ring them for a long time. Like, he was so special. I'm sorry, I just find it really cute. So I feel like he would know what a steeple is, but I can't, for the life of me, I can't figure out what a steeple is. Must be church related. Is that where they put the bells? Okay. Mostly it was. It is the point on the top of the church. Oh, thank you for the edification. Mostly it was a festival of sports, horse and mule racing, and foot racing by the swiftest of soldiers. Contests to chase down a greased pig, contests of strength, all with cash prizes. More than 10,000 showed up, including the highest master of ceremonies, or no, including the highest ranking generals of the army, Joe Hooker prominently. Marr, the master of ceremonies, dressed in a white beaver skin hat, green scarf, and blue swallowtails, launched, launched the races with a warning. Stand from under, he said. If that stage gives way, you will be crushed by 4 tons of major generals. This got him a big laugh, even from the 4 tons. Long wooden tables groaned with 35 hams, a side of roast ox, fire baked pigs stuffed with turkeys, and for the officers, 10 gallons of rum, 8 cases of champagne, and punch spiked with 22 gallons of whiskey. Marr's face had gotten fleshy and worn in this winter of dread, but just as he had made merry music with his clarinet at Stonyhurst while under suspension, as he had grinned his way through readings of verse while awaiting execution at his cell in Clonmel, as he had laughed till the woods rang around in a shepherd's hut reunion in Tasmania, Marr always found a way to find scraps of joy. In a cellar of despair, he needed those moments, needed to mark them in memory in order to call on them later in melancholy to keep himself from giving up. His last battle with the Brigade got underway in late April 1863. Oh, his last battle. Yeah, 2 gallons of Jack. Okay, here we go. Last battle. It was Joe Hooker's turn to move the set pieces, and he designed a flanking move on General Lee's left. The diminished Irish unit crossed the Rappahannock on April 30th and camped on the hamlet of Chancellorsville. Hooker had nearly twice the number of men as Lee's Confederates, but only half the nerve. He struck first and withered quickly as the rebels did not fold, and the Union men got bogged down in a tangle of brush called the Wilderness. Sorry, I'm drinking a lot for my coffee, but you guys on OF know it was quite a day. And It's quite hot in the California desert this time of year. Mm. Anyway, 99 bottles of beer on the wall. Mm. Lee sent Stonewall Jackson around back to encircle the attackers from their rear. He cut the Army of the Potomac to pieces. When the Irish were sent to the front, they ran into fleeing Federals. Their orders were changed from charging to holding the line of retreating soldiers at bayonet point. The losses were horrific. Captain John Lynch exploded in front of his men when he was hit by an artillery shell. Directing troop traffic, Marr took a few steps one way. A minute later, the ground where he had stood was cratered by another shell. After 3 days of battle, Hooker straggled back across the river. He had lost about 18,000 men. Dead, wounded, captured, or missing. I almost can't take anymore. It's like this is insane. Like it's so sad. Honestly, I feel like the Irish deserve a national holiday for this. Like I would put it in September. What was that big battle? Somewhere mid September where so many died. Um, this is just can they get a break at all? Among the casualties was the best general of the Civil War. As Jackson was galloping out of the brush, a Confederate commander mistook his troops for Federals. Pour it into them, boys! Shouted Major John Barry. Jackson had always believed that a righteous God had directed the general in battles on behalf of the slaveholders. What? If so, the providential design at the end was a cruel twist, shot by his own men. Stonewall Jackson died 8 days later. Marr was finished 5 days after the battle ended. In a letter to Major General John Hancock, he tendered his resignation as commander of what was once known as the Irish Brigade. There, yeah, this is like, no, you don't give a about us. This is there were no diplomatic niceties in this resignation. No, no pander in the prose. Marr was angry and indignant. He would okay. Imagine like if you worked at like not sponsored. I'm about to make a like a horrifying example of a place, right? Like a Walmart. Okay, and the manager of the Walmart was like of your section or whatever. Okay, so they're like promoted to that, even though like you've been there longer, you've applied more times, you've shown great qualities at being a manager, but yet it was given to someone else, and but they let you be like have like a team of people that you kind of represented, but they still manage what you did. And anyway, they ended up like lighting 90% of your people on fire. They're like, why don't you go like into the section of the store and like a burning hot flame? It's like, oh, you're basically you're mismanaging to a point of extreme negligence that is so disgusting of like people dying like when they had did not need to um and it's like yeah I would make that resignation later like when you get a chance I sent you the picture. Oh yeah, I saw the steeple was a top. Oh okay. Okay. He went through the casualties. Oh shit. In the major battles, reminded the general of how his men had been sacrificed at Mary's Heights, and yet fought again last week. And when he begged for relief, a break for his men to recover, it was never even acknowledged. This ungenerous and inconsiderate treatment of a gallant remnant of a brigade that had never once failed to do its duty left him deeply depressed, he wrote. Still, he remained faithful to the Union cause. He offered to serve in any other capacity but one. He could no longer send Irishmen to their deaths. Yeah, I totally get it. The resignation was accepted on May 14th. Marr assembled his immigrant soldiers around him for a farewell to arms. He told of his life to date, how remarkable it was for a man who'd seen so much of the underside of history to be breathing spring air in 1863. On three continents, at every turn, someone had tried to take from him the things he loved about his native land. What he held dear, he told his men, was the locket of the Irish carried when so far from home, memory, self tailored to joy. He could summon happy faces going back to Waterford, the schoolmates of Clongowes Wood and cellmates at Kilmainham, and every kid he talked into leaving a tenement in 5 points to become an American soldier. Then he said goodbye, shaking hands and offering personal words to each member of the Irish Brigade. New York was a steam bath on July 13, 1863. The street stones hot to the touch, the brick walls of tenements reflecting back a merciless sun. They had been this way for some time. Outside a four-story building at 677 Third Avenue, a crowd waited for fresh results of the first military draft in the United States. They smelled of sweat and liquor and swore like a wretched choir. The Union, its fighting ranks badly depleted, was doing what the South had already done, forcing men to go to war. Congress had passed a conscription act in March. Now came the lottery, names spinning in a hand cranked drum, then picked by a blindfolded clerk. When read and published, there were Kiernans and Kellys, McGee's and O'Briens. Already, no city had given more bodies to the Union cause than New York. The fevered men clutching broken cobblestones and iron pipes outside the draft office shared the same surnames. They had poured out of the tenements, had come with knives and clubs to go with bricks and rocks. The draft law, as long rumored, had allowed an exemption for the rich. For $300, you could buy your way out of service to the United States. Either that or come up with a substitute, cold cash or a live man. That's what it took to dodge a war that would claim more lives than any other American conflict. For many of the poor Irish cursing in the humidity on July 13th, the price of freedom was equal to a year's wages. For the well off, it was a trifling. One of the New Yorkers who had hired a substitute to fill his place in the army was a philanthropist and active Republican, Theodore Roosevelt Sr. The decision haunted his son Teddy. The guilt would roll over into another generation of family warriors trying to make up for the missed call to duty. Newly freed blacks were not eligible for the draft, for they were not citizens. They could enlist, and many did, or they could straggle along behind Union supply lines. An hour before noon, a pistol shot was fired outside that Third Avenue location of the draft lottery. No one was sure where it originated, but it became a starter signal for the worst riot in American history. The mob pushed past police officers, broke windows with stones and clubs, and charged into the office. The lottery drum was smashed, the room set afire. Outside, telegraph lines were cut, and the rails of street cars were torn apart with crowbars. The cops, who had tried to hold back the fisted crowd, ran for their lives. One who stood his ground was the police superintendent John Kennedy. "That's Kennedy!" came shouts of recognition. "Get him!" He was knocked to the ground and beaten senseless. When Kennedy tried to stagger away, he was mauled again and dragged into a puddle. His face was smashed into the mud and he nearly drowned. A tailor shop nearby was ransacked, the Irish proprietor beaten to a pulp. A colonel in the Union Army, Henry O'Brien, was lashed and pummeled until he died. The Irish, at least those in uniform or owning a business, would not be spared the wrath of other Irish. A handful of troops who'd been convalescing from wounds of Fredericksburg arrived to try to keep the peace. They were overwhelmed, losing their weapons, many knifed in the face or back. With stolen muskets, the mob went on a rampage through the center of Manhattan, setting fire to stores and breaking down the doors of townhouses. They shot at police officers and Union soldiers. A black man, William Jones, was grabbed as he walked toward a fruit vendor's store. He was stabbed, beaten, a noose coiled around his neck, and he was strung from a lamppost. They burned him as he died. Now, frenzied, blood on their hands, the mob moved to the colored orphan asylum. Oh no, you don't. On Fifth Avenue at 43rd Street, the rioters took the children's bedding and clothing, then torched the orphanage. They cheered as the walls collapsed and the roof crumbled. When fire crews arrived, they were stoned and their hoses cut. Some of the firemen dropped their axes and joined the rioters. The 200 orphans who lived at the asylum were rushed out a back entrance. Oh my God, thank God. What kind of sick, like, I get you're angry, but how you're not gonna get sympathy this way. Narrowly escaping death in the fire trap that had been their shelter. Nighttime brought more New Yorkers to a swelling river of rage. Itinerant laborers joining Irish from the slums. They moved outward and uptown, toward homes of the rich, breaking in and looting, smashing chandeliers and fine china, setting fire to tapestries on walls and upholstered couches in sitting rooms. By the end of the day, much of New York was aflame. The city defenseless and lawless. Surely many residents felt this was a plot from the South. The Confederate role, if any, was indirect. Earlier that month, the 3-day battle of Gettysburg ended with a loss for the South, but repelling Lee from Pennsylvania came at an unfathomable cost for the Union, almost 23,000 casualties. Throughout July, the names of the dead soldiers were published in New York papers, Irish names with disproportionately just like the Irish names disproportionately just like the draft. Mars Brigade was well known, but it was a fragment of his countrymen who fought overall. At Gettysburg, a remnant faction of the brigade, led by Colonel Patrick Kelly of County Galway, lost 200 of the 500 or so men still fighting under a green flag. In the days leading up to the riot, race baiting Democrats fanned ethnic flames, and anti Lincoln politicians worked up class rage. The question of 3 years earlier, would the Irish fight, had now become whose side are they on? Some Irish voices, Thomas Marr still among them, urged their countrymen not to listen to the demagogues trolling the tenements. Just weeks before the first names in the draft were called, Marr had given a brisk defense of the president and the Union cause at a public lunch in New York, where he was awarded the Kearney Cross for valor. Most of those who heard him speak sat on their hands. He was in Washington the day the riots erupted, seeking a fresh commission to serve Lincoln. Here's the thing, though. First of all, you're going to have a lot of people right off the bat that don't necessarily want to join a war. I say necessarily because if the cause is just, there are people that will consider, even though they don't want to die, obviously, like they will consider. But here's what's important: the fact that so many, and this is being reported, and people probably word of mouth, and Mars resignation letter, like this is probably well known, that they're so badly mismanaged and lives thrown away that I think that that probably made people more fearful of being drafted. Like you're being drafted to a certain death. And even if the cause is just, you're not going to win, or that you don't feel like confidence that you're being led by leadership that is at least worthy of your fight. And I think that that's important in uh so you want the cause to be right, but it's like thinking even of sports team. People like to be on a winning team. If you're winning these battles, I think people get more confidence. Like, yeah, I have I want to be part, or I at least feel better being part in this. And they could have had both, but again, I think there's such importance in planning. Have none of these people read The Art of War? All I'm saying, because I'm trying to think about right now, right? Like if there was to be a draft right now for God knows what, right? I mean, we haven't had a draft in a long time because we have enough volunteers, but which is sadly people that are in the lower end of the um economic status, which tells you something. Um, but anyway, I think but if there was, I think the same things would apply. Like look, if you look at Vietnam, where people were just, in a massive rate for a cause that was unworthy, and there's you kind of understand why you'd want to dodge. Anyway, I'm not justifying this type of riots, but um I'm trying to see both sides. Okay. The next day, a Tuesday, no black person in New York was safe. Ugh. Yeah, and why would you blame them? Burning the docks where African Americans labored, lynching dark skinned men caught in the crush. The mob moved without any design save the unpredictable direction of rage. They attacked symbols of wealth. Brooks Brothers, the clothing store, was plundered. They attacked symbols of authority. The mayor's residence was pelted with stones, and they attacked voices of emancipation. Horace Greeley was a target. The editor of the New York Times, Henry Richmond, manned a Gatling gun outside his building near City Hall. The mayor sent a desperate telegram to Washington pleading for the Union troops to save the city. It was a state of insurrection. The Secretary of War dispatched 5 regiments to Manhattan. They arrived on Wednesday and camped at Gramercy Park. In the midst of open savagery, Democratic politicians looked the other way, as did some clerics. You will no doubt be hard on us rioters tomorrow morning, a man wrote the New York Times on the second day of anarchy. But that $300 law has made us nobodies, vagabonds, and cast outs of a society for whom nobody cares when we must go to war and be shot down. We are the poor rabble, and the rich rabble is our enemy by this law. Why don't they let the it's a word that I will not say. Kill the slave driving race and take possession of the South. A more refined mind, that of the novelist Herman Melville, tried to understand what had brought his city to ruin. At night, listening to the sounds of shattered glass and gunfire, The writer sketched a few lines of verse. All civil charms, like a dream, dissolve. On the third day, the mobs moved on to armories, including one that housed the 69th, and stole away with guns and ammunition. They attacked the Broadway headquarters of the Irish Brigade, where Major Horgan had lain in state on Christmas Eve 7 months earlier. Protestant charities were burned, as were the homes of prominent Republicans. A federal gunboat steamed to New York and anchored at the foot of Wall Street. On the fourth and final day, nearly 6,000 soldiers fought house to house, tenement to tenement on the Lower East Side, artillery to go with musketry. By week's end, following the announcement that the draft had been temporarily suspended in New York, the city looked, well, I mean, I guess the city looked as if it had been shelled by Lee's army. The officials put the death toll at 105, though it was later found to be closer to 500. All of it was sickening to Meagher. Had the rioters known where to find him, he might have been killed by his own people. He said, torn limb from limb if they caught hold of me. Failing to grab Meagher, the mob marched on the house of his top lieutenant in the Irish Brigade, Colonel Robert Nugent, wounded at Fredericksburg by a bullet in the stomach. They sacked his house, cursing him a blank lover, and raised cheers for Jefferson Davis. In the colonel's den, enraged men slashed a portrait of Meagher, the face of the general, the man who had been hailed a decade earlier as the Irish American savior, a chief to unite and guide them, was cut and trampled and burned in the bonfire of hatred in Nugent's home. Oh, wow. That's the end of that chapter. Chapter 19. A second banishment. Oh, so now he's being banished. Oh, dear. And in Vietnam, too, and many of you will remember this, it was disproportionately poor people. It was disproportionately Black people as well that couldn't dodge the draft, Like the wealthy were not being, they were largely could get out of it. So that's why you have a lot of the death toll and a lot of the Vietnam vets were poor people and a lot of black people, which is, a disgrace to this country that having money makes your life worth more. That's not right. Anyway, chapter 19. In just 4 days' time, the reputation of the Irish in America, a standing that Meagher's Brigade had built at the cost of much loss of life, was in tatters. The papers decried the murderous Patties and Celtic beasts who became the ethnic face of the New York draft riots. Cartoonist Thomas Nast drew the immigrant poor as simians again in Harper's Weekly, gutting stores for liquor, clubbing policemen, stringing up blacks. I'm sorry to find that England is right about the lower class of Irish, wrote George Templeton Strong, the influential New York lawyer and diarist, a pillar of the city's Episcopalian elite. They are brutal, base, cruel cowards. Further, he saw them as subhuman. As he recorded in his private notes, creatures that crawl and eat dirt and poison every community they infest. The fuck? The fact that there hadn't been a draft to that point, more than that many people that rioted were like killed in battle so that you guys didn't even have to be drafted. So that You could sit in your ass and not be drafted. And I'm like, these people are subhuman. I hate when people paint like an entire group of people. It could be as simple as men and women, right? With a broad brush. Um, People of certain ages, nationalities. But it's like, oh, all these people, like, I mean, no one is subhuman, right? Except, okay, a few people come to mind. A few people come to mind. But it's not uh racial or gender things like this. Just certain specific people. But you know what I mean. Don't just like categorically. Though the Irish are like this. With class and religious passions stirred, Archbishop Hughes defended the mobs, but Marr could not. He saw nihilism and numb-hearted violence for what it was. He had found the love of his life and a second cause to kill and die for in this city, and he would not rest his voice. At the age of 40, as New York smoldered, Marr had gone to war as an agnostic on slavery. Something he shrugged off. It cannot be changed, he said. Now he was evangelical in his opposition to it, as he tried to find a larger meaning for the deaths of so many of his young countrymen he'd led to battle. The rubble in the streets had barely cleared when Marr rushed to show a side of the Irish at odds with the thugs who nearly brought down the city. He put his voice and pen to work in defense of Abraham Lincoln and against slavery. To the Irishman in Dublin, he explained what was at stake in a country holding nearly half as many Irish as those who never left. Make no mistake, he told his readers, in the old country, the great American conflict was a fight against the slave lords, the kings and princes of the cotton fields and rice swamps. He recalled how difficult it was as a young Ireland revolutionary to praise the United States, the enlightened democracy that had thrown off the British Empire while trying to ignore that country's slavery. That cancerous disease, the glaring disgrace of this great nation, and a violent contradiction of the principles on which it was established. He regretted not speaking out earlier, regretted the excuses, regretted looking the other way, and one more confession. The brig that brought him to New York in his long escape from Tasmania in 1852 had returned a runaway slave from South America to Georgia a year before. Same ship, one a passage to freedom, the other a voyage back to bondage. He remembered the saintly Smith O'Brien shaming him with the question, how was it I could bring myself to be an apologist of the slavery existing in the South? How indeed? Ambition was the simple answer. Marr never shied from the role so many of the Irish wanted him to play as their leader in America. His fellow exiles were Democrats, foes of abolition, and so was he by his earlier silence. And even though he was still a Democrat, with an election barely a year away that could toss Lincoln from office, he would not betray his commander in chief. But going public with a new burst of feisty opinions came at a great cost to Marr's standing. He was castigated in the Irish American press, called a fool, a Lincoln lover, among the printable epithets. So be it. He was done with all that. He wanted no more quarreling with defenders of slavery or with those who would refight the fights of the old sod, scabs of history that had prevented a unified Ireland from going forward. As for the great bulk of the Irishmen in this country, I frankly confess to an utter disregard, if not a thorough contempt of what they think or say of me. He could scarcely say which was worse, the riots or the apologist for the mayhem. To their own discredit and degradation, they have suffered themselves to be bamboozled into being obstinate herds. This was from a private letter sent to a brigade officer in the Union Army, but when it was later published in the New York Times and other outlets, the target put on Marr by the Irish was as big as the one the Know Nothings had placed on him. Marr became a pariah among his people, at least those who wielded a pen. A decade earlier, the Irish American had proclaimed all honor to Thomas Francis Marr. Now that paper viewed him with contempt and shed no tears for his fall from the high position he once held in the esteem and affection of his countrymen. He visited Lincoln in late November 1863. The president had been in bed for much of the prior 2 weeks. Words of the Gettysburg Address on November 19th on, or wait, I'm sorry. He had looked ghostly. People noticed when he rose to speak the 272 words of the Gettysburg Address on November 19th. On the train ride back to Washington, he felt feverish and weak. Headaches and back pain plagued him over the next few days. His temperature spiked, and a scarlet rash appeared on parts of his body. His doctors diagnosed the illness as a form of smallpox. On the 26th, the day he met Marr and a fellow Irish officer, one of Lincoln's personal secretaries wrote, "The president is quite unwell." Marr, a general without soldiers, meant enough to Lincoln that he was the only guest the sick president consented to see over the course of several days. He had tried, like Marr, to slough off the hatred that came his way. In the first year of liberation for slaves, Abraham Africanus, his opponents called him a dictator, a king, a tyrant. The end. Lincoln would, or the two men discussed a future role for Marr in a war with no visible end. Lincoln would try to find something for him. His commander in the West, Ulysses S. Grant, had taken Vicksburg in Mississippi that year as part of the largest amphibious operation conducted by an American force. He had shown the kind of steel that Lincoln was looking for in a general in chief. Maybe Grant had a position for him. While pursuing another run with the Union Army, Marr did not forget about Ireland. The heavy, the heavy losses of the brigade had torn him up. His belief, unshakable through a half dozen major battles, that he was a warrior with two destinies had never left him. But by mid 1863, it was hard to see how an army of Irish veterans in America could defeat the British Empire. He could stew and drink and find like minded lost Irish souls to commiserate with, or he could revive the fight in his heart. So, at the very time the Irish American and other papers were attacking Marr, he was negotiating to become a member of the Fenian Brotherhood, the Irish nationalist group whose members were well represented among the ranks of police officers and military members throughout North America. When the Fenians were founded a few years earlier, Meagher had resisted joining, mindful that a political career in the United States would require him to reach beyond the Irish masses in Boston and New York. 4 years later, after the deaths of so many of his countrymen, After being pilloried by Catholic clerics and press bullies who claimed to represent the exiles, Meagher had lost his hesitation. Free of caring about the fickle winds of public opinion, he took the oath. I, Thomas Francis Meagher, solemnly pledge my sacred word of honor as a truthful, honest man that I will labor with earnest zeal for the liberation of Ireland from the yoke of England and for the establishment of a free and independent government on Irish soil. A fellow Fenian, Michael Corcoran, hosted Meagher a few weeks after the Lincoln visit. The two best known Irishmen in America, together again, freed in a prisoner exchange in 1862, Corcoran had founded the Irish Legion, separate from Meagher's brigade, and had stung the rebels in a series of smaller battles in Virginia. Like Meagher, he was a brigadier general. The two friends made plans to celebrate Christmas with their wives near a winter camp at Fairfax Courthouse. Corcoran had been complaining of headaches. His doctors said he had never fully recovered from the privation he suffered at the hands of his Confederate captors. On the morning of December 22nd, 1863, the two officers rode off to the train station. Meagher on his way to New York to pick up Libby and Corcoran's wife and escort them to Virginia for the holidays. Riding back to camp, Corcoran fell from his horse and tumbled into a ditch. His went into convulsions, his face bruised and red. He died hours later, most likely from a burst blood vessel in his head, a stroke. A County Sligo man had survived the Great Hunger, a threatened court martial after he snubbed the Prince of Wales in New York, the Battle of Bull Run, dark months in a Confederate cell, and fresh battles in the South. Michael Corcoran was 36 at his death. Meagher was inconsolable. He felt as if he'd lost a sibling. There, in that very room which I had occupied for several days as his guest, he lay cold and white in death, with the hands which were once so warm in their grasp and so lavish in their gifts crossed upon his breast. Meagher wrote, the body was sent to New York, arriving on Christmas Day. He lay in state in the governor's room at City Hall, flags flown at half-mast throughout the city. The last Civil War orders of General Meagher arrived in September of 1864. He was sent to Tennessee to help guard the tail end of a very long and oft-severed Union supply line stretching from Nashville to Atlanta. Rebel fighters, hungry and hiding, no longer marching in crisp formation to brigade leveling deaths, were trying to bleed the artery that pumped food and fresh men into a Union assault to end the war. At the front of that line, making plans to march to the sea and choke the South was Major General William Tecumseh Sherman. He shelled Atlanta, killing civilians who had stayed behind, tearing up railroad tracks, raiding farms for field provisions. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it, Sherman wrote to Atlanta's mayor. He hit the slaveholders everywhere in their homes, their plantations, their public buildings. The Union now had 1 million men in uniform and more on the way. The South was out of money, out of food, out of troops to counter the steamroller making its way toward Richmond. The leaders of the Confederacy considered a last ditch plan to force thousands of slaves into fighting on behalf of their masters. Stupid plan. Prompting a dissonance that political minds shaped by white supremacy could not countenance. The day you make soldiers of them is the beginning of the end of the revolution, said Howell Cobb, a Georgia politician. Hey, moron! Yeah, yeah. You know what? I'm totally on your side. Give me the gun. Give me the yeah. Come on. I'll totally fight for you. Just I think I'll need that extra gun. Just extra fight, extra hard. Georgia politician and former Speaker of the House of Representatives and a rebel general. If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong. Well, it's wrong. For the North, they made excellent soldiers. 180,000 blacks served in the Union Army. Your theory is wrong. Surrender terms were offered to the breakaway nation, not yet 4 years old. Jefferson Davis, his bully goat tuft of chin hair flapping in rage, rejected calls for peace. He was as haughty and uncompromising as ever. His army executed black soldiers they captured, troops that were now fighting some of the very men who had enslaved them. You may emancipate every Negro in the Confederacy, but we will be free, the Confederate president declared, even if we have to see every Southern plantation sacked and every Southern city in flames. The flames came soon enough. Pounded by Sherman, the rebels abandoned Atlanta on September 1st, burning everything of military use. That's how it's done. You got to strike at the heart. Marr had never forgiven Sherman for how he treated the Irish at Bull Run, and Sherman could not let go of Marr's description of him, which had found its way into print. The envenomed martinet. In the 3 years since the first big battle of the war, Marr had lost his brigade, but Sherman had lost his mind. The cinnamon haired officer fell into an unshakable depression in the fall of 1861. Unable to see beyond a fog of despondency, he was temporarily relieved of his command. Newspaper headlines proclaimed what Sherman himself had feared. The general was insane. He talked to the floor, mouth motoring, sputtering gibberish. He repeated certain refrains of woe, of doubt, of anger, over and over and over. His fingers tapped ceaselessly on desktops. His eyes darted back and forth, and his bewhiskered chin was in a constant twitch. He couldn't sleep and ate very little. I'm up all night, he wrote his wife. I find myself riding a whirlwind, unable to guide a storm. During a convalescence at home in St. Louis, he took to books and long walks. His mind uncoupled from war. At the start of a new year, 1862, the darkness passed. He revived his career under General Grant. He stood by me when I was crazy, Sherman said of Grant, and I stood by him when he was drunk. I wonder if it was like syphilis or something. Doesn't that make people crazy? Marr kept his distance from his old nemesis. While Sherman marched toward Savannah in the fall of 1864, torching fields and farmhouses along the way, Marr took to the stage in Nashville, orating for the president's reelection. Speaking to the state legislature, the army for the army let him campaign for the commander in chief and take other speaking engagements when he wasn't in the field. In public, he was still the man who made music with his spoken words. In private, he was lonely, vulnerable, and had premonitions of death. Do come, he wrote Captain W.F. Lyons, a longtime acquaintance, and bring any true friend or two of mine along with you you can find. It may be the last time, God only knows, that you shall see me. Another blow was the loss of William Smith O'Brien, the gentleman of Young Ireland. He'd been traveling in Wales when he collapsed dead at the age of 60. His coffin was mobbed on the streets of Dublin en route to the family home near Limerick. 3 of the 7 rebels shipped to Tasmania. The merchant Terence McManus, the law clerk Patrick Donahue, and the member of Parliament William Smith O'Brien had now died. Both Meagher and Sherman, in their own ways, helped Lincoln become the first president to win a second term in more than 30 years. The Democrats had nominated McClellan, Lincoln's former military right arm. The Little Napoleon's party ran on a peace platform. The Union shall call a truce and negotiate terms to end the war. But Sherman's autumn triumphs in Georgia made that platform look like a retreat. Just as the tide was finally turning for the North, McClellan's backers also played to race fears. A covert campaign spread word that Lincoln wanted blacks and Irish to breed and blend, creating a degraded race at the bottom. The things that people were allowed to write, like it's just like I'm now I'm imagining like what would I be called? I definitely would be considered by them a degraded race at the bottom. Who wants to blend with me? It makes them What's a fool? Miscegenation, a fright line, bold-faced in thousands of pamphlets, circulated in Hibernian havens, was his secret plan. Marr would not abandon the president who had never abandoned him. He liked McClellan personally, but he told the Irish who would still listen to him, the Irish who filled the ranks of nearly every Union infantry division, that it was in their best interest to stick with Abraham Lincoln. In November, McClellan was crushed, losing every state but 3. More than 75% of Union soldiers voted for Lincoln, but the president lost New York City, just getting 33% of the vote. In the war's final 6 months, Marr was sustained by poetry and drink, verse he could still use to draw a crowd and a cheer. One of his fans, the Reverend George W. Pepper, had last heard Marr speak at his sentencing to death in Clonmel in 1848. At the time, the English press said Marr's words, "The history of Ireland explains this crime and justifies it," would last no longer than his life, then scheduled to end at the age of 25. Fools, wrote Pepper, they might as well attempt to crush the Andes or the Rocky Mountains. A Protestant from the north of Ireland, the chaplain idolized Marr for the gift of his speech. Men like him came along but once every other generation, he believed. On stage, facing a room full of strangers, Marr was an athlete. When he heard of Marr's plan to devote an evening to poetry, the chaplain went to General Sherman to ask for a short leave. Sherman muttered a caustic aside, lumping Marr in with the New York Irish who had rioted and shown sympathy for the South. Not true. After ex-slaves paid less than other Northern soldiers, mistreated, fighting for a nation that would not let most of them vote or hold office, had fought and died for the Union, Marr came out publicly for full rights to our black comrades on the battlefield. He defended them as he had defended starving Irish peasants grabbing pitchforks to stare down British artillery. By their desperate fidelity to the fortunes of the nation, in many a fierce tempest of the war, they repaid in torrents of generous blood the prescription and wicked bondage in which, under the stars and stripes, they have been for a generations held. Marr said, the black heroes of the Union Army have not only entitled themselves to liberty, but to citizenship. In that sentiment, he was well ahead of much of the country. He was starting to build a case, born in his lowest moments after Fredericksburg, that the Irish had sacrificed their lives for the cause of a nation that must live up to the egalitarian promise of its founding. Marr saw it now with the clarity in which he had seen the need for Irish rule at the height of the Great Hunger. He was out on a far limb, a minority voice among the exiles in America. Freeing the slaves was one thing, but full citizens, fellow Democrats wondered what had gotten into Marr. Feuding with the Irish and now killing any chances of political opportunity within his party, he was dismissed as a lost soul. On a cold Tennessee night, Marr packed a hall with people weary of war and the language of violence. They came to Nashville to hear him talk about Chaucer and Shakespeare, Lord Byron, and an old favorite of his from Dublin. Someone only a few people in the audience would recognize, Speranza, the mother of 10-year-old Oscar Wilde. War was temporary, he reminded them, the worst thing that humans can do to each other. But the images constructed by the poets were immortal. Our better angels, as another man of words, Lincoln, had said. The audience swooned. Women waved handkerchiefs and men stood and shouted, Bravo! Pepper turned to his post in Georgia with the loft, or returned with the loft of Marr's love of poetry in his head. The drink increased with his final duty. Marr had command of a passel of men who'd been wounded, misplaced, or disciplined. The soldiers who didn't fit, they called themselves the convalescents. Their lives dimmed and damaged in battle. As one of them, Marr was a perfect man to lead. But though they were bandaged and battered, they were expected to fight. An army of convalescents didn't sound like anything that would strike fear in the heart of Johnny Reb. So they were renamed the Provisional Army of Tennessee, more than 10,000 strong, the military equivalent of a mutt. No one expected Marr's wounded soldiers to do anything more than put up a show of limping bluecoats to keep a desperate cadre of graybacks from attacking the railroad between Chattanooga and Knoxville. The South was down to a few last hopes. One was to bleed Sherman's rear. What? As Marr had molded immigrants from 5 Points into some of the best fighters in the Union Army, he made his provisional army into a formidable force, strategizing and skirmishing by day and drinking heavily by night. Marr surprised the generals who had written him off. Over 3 months, Marr's convalescents did what was asked of them. The rebels were rebuffed, allowing the Northerners to march freely to the sea. On December 22nd, Sherman telegraphed Lincoln, I beg to present to you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah. For his role, Marr won high praise from his commanding officer. Your splendid success and the harmony and good order maintained by your men throughout the district have given me much satisfaction, wrote General James B. Stephen. The officers of the entire command were proud of him. Well, not the entire command. Sherman withheld any praise for the Irish general. He ordered Marr to pack up the best of his convalescents and travel by river to Pittsburgh, then overland to meet the bulk of the Union force as it advanced north through the Carolinas. Out of harm's way, with idle days on the railroad, the Provisional Army lived up to the earlier low expectations. They partied, they drank, they disobeyed orders, they left without leave, they slept late, they harassed locals at train stops. Marr, never much of a disciplinarian, was blamed. By the time they arrived in Pittsburgh in January of 1865, the 6,500 remaining convalescents were more trouble than help. Conflicting orders dispersed them to different places. Many deserted. Marr went ahead to a hotel in Baltimore and a likely liaison with Libby. The whole command is but a mob of men in uniform. One general complained to Sherman. That was it. The Union brass had seen enough of the Irish general. Marr was mustered out of the army in March. He returned to New York in time for St. Patrick's Day. No doubt he would appeal again to Lincoln and expect a fair hearing. While in Tennessee, he'd been thinking about a new life, starting from scratch in the far west. He'd always liked California, and what he'd seen in between was an alluring swath of open country. Lincoln should be favorably inclined to offer the general an appointment in one of the territories as a reward for all he'd lost in political capital by the Irish by campaigning for a Republican. But it would never be. Sherman ripped a path through South Carolina. No apologies for hires and plunder in the Palmetto State. Many in Sherman's army wanted revenge. South Carolinians were traitors. The silky-voiced politicians, the crisp-collared officers manning big guns, the wives who egged their men on, and the slave masters whose cause all the killing had been done, Sherman's men showed little restraint. Richmond was abandoned on April 2nd, 1865. Jefferson Davis and his war cabinet fleeing town on one of the last operating rail lines. In retreat, his soldiers burned bridges and factories, fires spreading to a larger conflagration that left the city in ruins. Mobs ran through Richmond, elegant no more, setting flame to Confederate currency, axing open barrels of liquor from the cellars of Virginia aristocrats. By dawn, the capital of the Confederacy looked like a garbage dump, smoke curling from piles of rubble. Lincoln went to Richmond with his 12-year-old son, Tad, sat at the very seat of the rebel president, the American flag overhead. Thank God I have lived to see this, he said. In the streets of the conquered city, he was mobbed by blacks savoring their first days out of bondage. You are free, free as air, said Lincoln. You can cast off the name of slave and trample upon it. The military had now completed its part. After Lincoln had mastered the political realm, in January, the president had cajoled reluctant Democrats to join Republicans in Congress to pass the 13th Amendment, outlawing slavery in every part of the United States. At war's end, he was 56 years old, but it was striking how much a great conflict had broken him physically. Scuffed by time, he was both wizened and made wise by the Civil War. I sometimes think I am the tiredest man on earth, he said. Lincoln lived just a few more days. On April 14th, Good Friday, the president was shot by an actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth, who had seethed about blank citizenship while hatching a plot to kill the great emancipator. With a bullet in his bleeding skull, Lincoln died on the morning of April 15th. Whitman grieved in verse. "O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rock. The prize we sought is won. My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. Marr assembled some of his ex-officers at the Astor House in New York to mourn the commander-in-chief who'd once kissed the flag of the Irish Brigade. He drew up plans to travel to Washington to be part of the honor guard as Lincoln's body lay in state, and he made sure that the emerald flag that had been knocked down at the sunken road and wrapped around the body of the last color bearer in the slaughter at Mary's Heights would be displayed under the Capitol dome. Near the dead president, the orator offered a few words about what Lincoln meant to him and to the Irish, eloquent remarks, as the New York Times reported, without further elaboration. I always think it's crazy that he was killed by an actor that would today be like, who comes to mind? Who comes to mind? Who comes to mind? Tom Cruise or like uh I'm I don't know, Ben Affleck. Not Ben, is Ben Affleck? Yeah, Ben Affleck's like a movie star. Like it's just weird. Or who would be like a um who was on like one of those. I don't know. I don't. Oh, Pedro Pascal, maybe? Yeah, he's kind of like a star, right? Like, it's just crazy. Mm. Although he's not really on The Last of Us anymore, is he? Mm. Spoiler, sorry. Robert E. Lee, his army of Northern Virginia shredded, surrendered to General Grant on April 9th at Appomattox Courthouse. To generous terms, rebel officers were allowed to keep their sidearms and soldiers to walk away with their horses, mules, and muskets. Several members of the Irish Brigade stood by, just outside the room where Lee put an end to the short, violent life of the Confederate States of America. Not far away, John Mitchell scrambled through the ruins of Richmond in search of safe haven, having given up two of his sons to what many in the South would later call the Lost Cause. One of the Mitchell boys died at Gettysburg, another at Fort Sumter. A third was wounded at Mary's Heights behind a rock wall. Mitchell was arrested and sent to Fort Monroe on the southern tip of the Virginia Peninsula. During the war, the moated compound had been a refuge for runaway slaves. Freedom's Fortress, it was called. Now it was a warehouse for traders. Jefferson Davis and John Mitchell, its two best known occupants. All of the awful tallies were not yet in, but scholars would eventually determine that more than 700,000 people died in the war. When the wounded, the sick, the lost, the captured, the missing, and never found were added to the toll, the human cost of the fight over America's original sin was at least 1.5 million people. Nearly 140,000 men of Irish birth fought for the Union, a third of them from New York City. Only two other units suffered greater battlefield losses than the Irish Brigade, a casualty rate of more than 50%. Wasn't he in The Mandalorian? Should I go with Tom Hanks? I don't know. We're almost done with this chapter. We'll end it there, okay, for the night. Early summer 1865, New York was clogged with Irishmen newly out of uniform, officers devoid of command, free blacks trying to find a place in a nation where the broken pieces were not easy to fit together. The brigade was long disbanded. Some of the soldiers had joined the Frenians, who were plotting to strike across the border at British North America. Father Corby was back in Notre Dame, soon to be named president of the school in South Bend. Marr's friend, Captain Lyons, found him at the place he now called home in Manhattan, his brother in law's brownstone on East 23rd Street. The house was bursting with riches and books, said to be the largest private library in America. Marr leaned against the fireplace mantel, a letter and small photograph in one hand. Lyons couldn't tell if he'd been crying when he came upon him. His eyes were clouded. That would not surprise him. He knew that the toll of the past 2 years, losing the Brigade, losing Corcoran, Kavanaugh, Emmett, and countless others, losing his name among influential Irish Americans, losing Lincoln, had taken much of the life out of the man who seemed impressible or irrepressible. He was gazing at a picture of the son he had never seen, 11 years old, Thomas Bennett Marr. The boy had his father's good looks, and judging by the letter, some of his skill with words. Now, Lyons drew close enough to tell Marr was not crying. He was laughing at the pleasant and loving things the lad had written, and handed me the letter with a proud allusion to the manliness of its style. He said. Marr thrust the image of his son at his friend, an absentee father's pride bursting. He wanted the boy to know something of the legacy of memory that he would inherit. It wasn't all skeletons at the feast. The youngest Marr would soon be burdened with a sizable number of centuries to keep alive in narrative form. Family stories, Tipperary struggles during the penal era, new life in Newfoundland, and a merchant renaissance along the River Suir, defiance in one of England's best schools, and finding a voice in the revolutionary salons of Dublin, the great honor of the Great Hunger, an uprising of poets that never had a chance, bravery in a cell waiting to be hanged, a stirring of the senses in Tasmania, the dead mother of this boy, and love a second time in New York. A woman who could still be mother to another Thomas Marr, America's promise and America's crime. The boy had surely read in the Irish press his father's explanation of what the immigrant soldiers meant to every son and daughter of Erin. Thank God, Marr wrote in words reprinted across the tormented island, that disgrace of slavery is no more, averted from our race by the splendid conflict of the thousands of Irish soldiers who have been the life, the heart, the soul of the federal armies. He expected to see young Thomas soon, to be a proper father yet, in this coming turn in a life he himself found so improbable as to not try to recount it in a single sitting with new friends. First, he needed to make some money. The West was opening quickly. Fortunes were being made overnight in the gold fields and towns sprouting from the sage land. It could be a last chance or a first chance. I leave this evening for the far West, for one of the richest of our new territories, he wrote his son and his father on July 17th, 1865. I entertain the liveliest hopes that this enterprise will provide profitable one will prove a profitable one to me, and that it will enable me to pay you a visit in France next summer. Thomas and Libby would close out their New York life, their military life, their Eastern life, the wilds of Montana Territory called. Marr was 41 years old when he lit out for the sunset side of the continent. That is the end of chapter 19. We'll pick it up on chapter 20 tomorrow. Oh, this is interesting. It's titled New Ireland. What are you gonna do in Montana? Um, I was very much reminded um of what of what Terry told me of uh Irish fighting back home on Friday. Was it Friday or last Friday? Um, it's like some of those people, they can riot like crazy. They can Yep. Not all, but some. Anyway, yeah, we pick it up there tomorrow. Boy, do I got some cleaning ahead of me this next few days. For now, I have to pee. So I say good night to you. I love you. Get some rest. I see you tomorrow.